Being enslaved in such a hostile environment and time period, how far and dangerous of a journey is someone willing to undergo in order to gain their freedom? Without even knowing, many slaves will be making history by escaping through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad. It was a network of people working secretly to help slaves escape to freedom in the northern states and Canada. This network of escape routes or Freedom Trail operated for many years before and during the Civil War. The Underground Railroad was neither underground because escaping slaves and the people who helped them were breaking the law. They had to stay out of sight. They went underground in terms of concealing their actions. It spanned through 29 states. Its railways were back roads, swamps, caves, forests, rivers, and streams. Many enslaved people escaped to cities in the north or went to Mexico, the Caribbean islands, South America, or even remote areas in the south and west. They created their own code words and terminology. Those who went south to find slaves seeking freedom were called pilots. Those who guided slaves to safety and freedom were conductors. The slaves were passengers. People's homes or businesses where fugitive passengers and conductors could safely hide were stations. Those who hid fugitive slaves in their homes, barns, or churches were called station masters. Slaves who were in the safekeeping of a conductor or station master were cargo. Stations were added or removed from the Underground Railroad as ownership of the house changed. Establishing stations were done quietly by word of mouth. Records were not kept in order to protect the people. The fugitive slaves referred to Canada as the Promised Land, the Ohio River as the River Jordan, and the Big Dipper as Drinking Gorge. Hundreds and thousands of slaves escaped to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a miraculous success, leaving a mark in American history.
Before the Underground Railroad was discovered and used, the South was repressive and unapologetic towards slavery. Slaves were treated poorly. Many were abused by their owners, and their owners felt no pity for them. Many slaves were separated from their families and were left alone with no one to turn to for help. Many slaves grew tired of being treated unfairly. Some took action, but many were afraid to do so in fear of their owners finding out and taking action themselves. Every day, a slave would wake up, do the same routine, but wish and hope for change and opportunity. Within time, a movement arose called the Abolitionist Movement. This movement fought for anti-slavery and wanted to abolish slavery once and for all. Many fought and urged slaves to take action to encourage them to fight for their freedom. During the abolitionist movement, many well-known abolitionists came to the surface. Among them was David Walker, a man who was born free. Walker wrote a novel, The Appeal, that told slaves to come together and fight for and claim their rights. Another abolitionist was William Garrison. Garrison believed that slaves were entitled to their rights. Garrison later created the newspaper, The Liberator, to get the message of the abolitionist movement out to the world. A woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, an American abolitionist and author, wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel spoke about anti-slavery, and her book caused a spark to encourage slaves and others to stop slavery. The book helped continue the abolitionist movement back in the 1850s. It also talked about how slaves needed and must take action to escape the awful abuse from their owners. All these books and newspapers spoke and reached out to slaves, giving them the push to want their freedom from the South. With their compelling words of wisdom, slaves found the courage to escape.
The fugitives sometimes traveled on boat or train, but most of the time on foot or wagon. They traveled in small groups of 1 to 3 most of the time. However, Charles Torrey and his colleagues rented horses and wagons, helping about 15 to 20 slaves at one time. All slaves knew the best time was to travel at night due to the lower risk of them getting caught. There were stations, also known as safe houses, that the slaves traveled to. Each safe house was about 10 to 20 miles apart and was designated with the pattern quilt. There were also guides involved, which were called conductors, that helped move the runaways from each station. Some of the conductors include Harriet Tubman, Josiah Henson, Jonathan Walker, and Lewis Hayden. The slaves were directed to use waterways such as swamps, rivers, lakes, and so forth. The benefit of using waterways is that the agent's search unit would not smell them. The slaves would stop at each station during the day to rest. While resting, a message would be sent to the next station to let the station master know the runaways were on their way. This journey was knowingly difficult and dangerous for children and women, which led to separation of many families. Because of the fear of these routes being discovered, information on these routes and safe houses were only passed along by word of mouth.
There comes a time in every person's life when the world seems to be ending right in front of them. African Americans experienced this feeling during the time of slavery, a time when there was fear of getting beat, raped, lynched, sold, and separated from their own families. The only thing that kept them motivated was hope, the hope to one day be free. Their road to freedom was the Underground Railroad. 3 stories that have made a mark in history were those of Daniel Fisher, Charles Lucas, and the slave girl and the soldiers. Daniel Fisher was a slave who escaped from his master in South Carolina. His trip was difficult because he didn't know where he was going at first. He wandered into the woods and walked by night, and during the day he would hide. Throughout his trip, he encountered many challenges like crossing rivers, severe weather conditions, and hunger. He built a den, which was his home for 3 months. After hiding for 3 months, he came across a vessel. The captain of this vessel was a secret conductor who sent him to a safe house where he was given food. And here he received instructions to keep walking, and soon he would be arriving in Pennsylvania, a free state. He traveled through South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Washington, Baltimore, and the Delaware River, and finally arrived in Pennsylvania. Charles Lucas was a slave who began his escape in Potomac. He crossed hills and rivers. He was forced to swim even when the weather conditions weren't in his favor. Charles suffered from hunger and dehydration. He was chased by dogs and hunters, but he was never caught. One day he encountered an old white man who conducted him into the Dutchman's safe house. Here he was given food and clear instructions of where to go next. He was told to always move forward, to stay away from the road but close to the road, to follow the Underground Railroad. He was to avoid questions, and the road would lead him to the free states. The slave girl, whose name is unknown, escaped from her master in Kentucky. After nights of struggle, she arrived at a camp called 22nd Wisconsin. At this camp, she was welcomed and kept a secret. The soldiers decided to help her and take her to the north. She had to dress in soldier attire and was placed in a wagon underneath some hay. The soldiers, dressed as citizens, drove her to a safe house in Cincinnati. After arriving, the very light-skinned slave girl had to change her appearance to that of a white lady, elegantly and with a veil. She was then boarded into a train which took her into the north, the free states. The stories of Daniel Fisher, Charles Lucas, and the slave girl and the soldiers were a few of the stories that were successful because of the Underground Railroad. Although many lives were lost, the Underground Railroad was a passage that gave joy and a feeling of accomplishment to thousands of African American slaves. The joy of being free.
Who's that yonder dressed in white?